So, once upon a time, when God first began creating the heavens and the earth, all space was an empty and formless void, welter and waste and darkness. There was nothing except for the breath of God hovering over the water. God said, "Let there be light." God made a place for the light and a place for the darkness, and loved them both. So there was evening and there was morning, the first day. Or at least as the story goes, God created the light and the dark, but we know that God created more than that. There are different levels of dark. There's the kind of dark that's just enough to make it hard to read. Then there's the kind of dark that makes you worried you're going to step on something. And of course, there's a kind of dark where you instinctively walk carefully with your arms stretched out around you and in front of you so you don't run into anything. There are different levels of light, too. There's the kind of light that's just enough to see by in the early morning. Then there's the kind of light that shows everything clearly. And of course, there's the kind of light that is almost blinding, leaving you squinting and trying to shade your eyes. God made the light and the darkness, and God made everything in between. God's breath swept over the water and blew it back to create dry land above the water, and sky above the dry land, and clouds in the sky to water the dry land. So there was evening and there was morning, the second day. Or at least, as the story goes, God created the sky. But we know that God created more than that. God created the kind of heights where you can look out over an entire city, and the kind of heights that you have to climb literal mountains to reach, and the kind of heights where airplanes fly, and the kind of heights that touch the boundary between our atmosphere and outer space, 62 miles above sea level. God made the skies that soar over the earth, and God made everything in between them. God was delighted with the earth and the seas, and God's breath took form as seeds that burst from the ground with plants and trees and flowers and vines and fruits and vegetables of all kinds. So there was evening and there was morning, the third day. Or at least, as the story goes, God created the seas and the dry land, but we know that God created more than that. God created marshlands and swamps and bogs and seasonal streams and lakes and puddles and ponds and the smell of dust after the rain. There are many places where we can find water while we're standing on dry land. We couldn't survive as a species if there weren't. And there are also places in the water where we find dry land, islands, continents for that matter, and volcanoes that grow underwater and become mountains, and rocks that rise up above the water, some big enough for a lighthouse or a home, and some barely big enough to stand on. And as the story goes, God made every kind of vegetation to grow on the dry land. But there are plenty of seed-bearing plants that grow in the ocean and in lakes, and there are even seed-bearing plants that can grow in the air. God made the seas and the dry land, and God made everything in between. And God made a rich diversity of vegetation that grows in all kinds of places, all across the globe. God's hands clapped in glee and reached out to hang lights in the sky to mark time, a close star to be our sun, and countless stars far away to guide us in the night and make the earth gaze up in awe at the sparkling beauty of it all. So there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. Or at least, as the story goes, God created the stars and created the sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night. But we know that God created more than that. God created comets and asteroids and meteors and planets and interstellar dust. God created entire worlds and galaxies that human eyes will never see. Entire worlds and galaxies that we can only imagine. Entire worlds and galaxies that the ancient world had no idea existed. God made the sun and the moon and the stars and everything in between them. God filled the seas with living creatures that glided through the waters, aquatic creatures of all kinds. God filled the sky with birds that soared through the air, flying creatures of all kinds. God saw that they were good and beautiful and precious, and God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the seas and the skies." So there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. Or at least as the story goes, God created every creature in the sea and every winged bird that flies above the earth. But we know that God created more than that. God created animals that split their time between the water and the land, and animals that evolved to leave the water and live on the land instead. God created mammals who fly above the earth, and birds that can't fly, and even some birds that don't have wings. God made every creature in the sea, and every winged bird that flies above the earth, and everything in between. God filled the earth with animals of every kind and saw that it was good. God loved the earth and everything that was in it. And so God spoke life into being again and made all of humankind, male and female, in God's own image. And God invited them to love the world as God loved it. So there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Or at least as the story goes, God created all of humankind, male and female, in God's own image. But we know that God created more than that. Of every height and size and skin tone, of every physical ability, of every mental ability, of every blood type, of every chromosomal variation, straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, cisgender, transgender, non-binary, intersex, two-spirit, queer. God made all of humankind in God's own image. God's own image must be as vast as the universe itself, to be reflected in the soul of every person who ever lived. God is beyond gender, and to only refer to God with one image in mind is to limit God's capacity to contain infinite multitudes. Over the past almost 7 years, you may have noticed that I only really refer to God as masculine when we recite the Lord's Prayer. As we say in my circles, God is not a boy's name. God made all of humankind, male and female and everything in between, in God's own image. God looked out at everything God had made and smiled and blessed the seventh day as a day of rest. God is the Alpha and the Omega and everything in between. God is the first and the last and everything in between. God is the beginning and the end and everything in between. There are many aspects of Hebrew poetry that don't quite translate. We can't really get the puns and the acrostics and double entendres because they don't work in English. There are also a few aspects of Hebrew poetry that just don't feel super familiar to the poetry that we know today. Sometimes a line will repeat itself with slightly different wording, something like, "On the couch lay a young cat, and a kitten the child of a cat." That's not to say that there are two cats on the couch, it's just to emphasize that the cat is worth noting. In the book of the prophet Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9, we read, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Again, it's not a super familiar kind of poetry to us, but it also felt unfamiliar to the author of the Gospel of Matthew, who references this verse of Zechariah in the story of Palm Sunday, but describes Jesus as literally riding on both a donkey and a colt. Fun fact. And then we have things like God describing himself as the Alpha and the Omega, which are the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. They also happen to be among the imagery in the etched glass windows between the narthex and the sanctuary. In English, we wouldn't say something like, "Yeah, she's so smart, she knows A and Z." Instead, we would say something more like, "She's so smart, she knows everything from A to Z," or if we're Canadian, Z. So when God is the Alpha and the Omega, like in the letter of Revelation, or when God creates light and dark, we understand that we're not just talking about two extremes. We're talking about the entire spectrum between those extremes. There's a lot in the Bible that is pretty rigidly either or, especially in the Hebrew Bible. You're either with Moses or you're dying with Pharaoh. You're either clean or unclean. You're either a favored son or one of the spares. There's all kinds of laws in books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy that are pretty clear-cut, whether or not any of us follow all of those rules today. It might be easy to impose that kind of thinking onto this first creation story in the book of Genesis. God created this thing and that thing, shaped the one place and then the other one, created the animals here and the animals there. But of course, there are nuances within all of God's acts of creating. That's like the point. Neither of the creation stories in Genesis were ever intended to be taken literally. This first story is poetry painting a picture of the grandeur of God's work, zoomed out to look at the whole universe, marveling in just how much God created. The second story is poetry painting a picture of the personal love and care God put into creating everything, zoomed in to look at just one garden. But this story spans everything, and God calls all of it good. No matter what humans may call each other, God called us not just good, but very good. And so if humans call each other anything less than very good for existing the way we were born, or for the way we look, or for daring to be honest about our sexual orientations and gender identities, or for anything else that God created us to be, if humans call each other anything less than very good for existing the way we were born, then we are not just insulting each other, we are insulting God's own handiwork. Let us pray. Holy God, for all of your acts of creation, we praise you and we give you thanks. For everything in the heavens and on the earth, and for everything in between, we thank you. For biodiversity, we thank you. And we thank you in particular for all of the cute, friendly animals who let us pet them and give them treats. Help us to see the world as you see it, to see that every person was made in your image, no matter how different they may be from us. Help us to celebrate the rich tapestry of the human experience. Help us to learn from each other and to refrain from judging each other for the way that we were born.